What if the signs were there all along, not in thunder or glory, but in the quiet moments of your childhood? What if the dreams you had, the burdens you carried, the things you felt too deeply, weren't random at all? What if they were the early whispers of a calling, not yet named but already known? From an early age, there was something about you that didn't quite match the world around you. It wasn't arrogance, nor was it self-pity. It was something subtler, like an invisible thread tugging at the corner of your mind, whispering that you were meant for something different. While others seemed at home in their routines, accepting the world as it was handed to them, you often stood at the edges, not quite fitting in, but not trying very hard to either. It wasn't that you were excluded, it was that you were elsewhere in your thoughts, half present in the room, half drifting into a world that you couldn't quite explain. You were not alone, of course. The world was full of noise, laughter, colors, and distractions. But even as a child, you felt something just beneath the surface of things. A sense that the world was layered, that there were meanings behind actions, echoes beneath words. You asked strange questions that adults didn't know how to answer. You puzzled over why things were unfair, not just for yourself, but for others. And you wondered deeply what your role in all of it was. That quiet questioning, almost embarrassing to speak aloud, set you apart. Other children asked for toys and treats. You, on occasion, asked about truth, or time, or why people stopped dreaming as they grew up. You noticed things others did not, the loneliness behind someone's smile, the way silence stretched in certain rooms, the odd flutter of your heart when you stood under a night sky too vast to comprehend. You were aware, sometimes painfully so, that you didn't entirely belong to the world as it was. You belonged to something more, though you couldn't name it. At times this feeling made you quiet. At other times, it made you bold. You would say things that startled grown-ups, not because they were rude, but because they were strangely clear. You had a way of seeing through people's masks, of identifying what was real. It was both a gift and a burden. Often you would retreat into imagination, not as an escape, but as a return. While others played to mimic the world around them, your games were quests, your drawings were maps, your dolls and action figures were warriors or ambassadors in battles unseen. And though no one told you this explicitly, you instinctively understood that something or someone was watching. Not in a way that made you afraid, but in a way that made you careful, as if your life mattered in a way others had not yet recognized. You sensed a kind of attention from the universe itself, or something beyond it. This awareness could sometimes make you feel lonely, not in the sense of being unloved, but in the sense that you were carrying something you couldn't quite share. You saw friends content with simple joys, and though you participated, there was always a small distance in your spirit, as if you were waiting for a door to open, a signal to begin. You didn't know what you were waiting for, but you knew that when it came, you would be ready. And so you lived, both in the world and slightly above it, walking a path no one else seemed to notice. Not chosen by crowds or teachers, or even your own ambitions, but chosen by something older, quieter, and far more mysterious. As a child, your gaze often drifted beyond what the eye could see. While others were content with facts and games, your mind reached into places no one had taught you to explore. You were not satisfied with just how things worked. You wanted to know why. Why do we exist? Why do we feel what we feel? Why does something inside us ache when we look at the stars? These questions came to you not because you read them somewhere or overheard them in conversations, but because they arose from within you like a quiet, persistent echo. You didn't always have the language to express it, but you carried a deep yearning for something more than the visible world offered. You were drawn to mystery, not the kind in detective stories, but the mystery behind life itself. You stared longer than others at candle flames, wondering how something so small could hold warmth, light, and movement. You listened to music not just with your ears, but with your entire being, sensing something behind the notes, as if they were trying to tell you something just out of reach. When you looked at old trees or heard the wind rustle through leaves, you felt as if they were speaking in a language you almost understood. Something ancient and alive seemed to surround you, and though you couldn't name it, you knew it was real. You noticed how people spoke about the world in absolutes, how they clung to explanations that left no room for wonder. Yet deep inside, you resisted that closure. You had a quiet conviction that not everything should be explained. Some things were meant to be felt, to be pondered, to be respected in their vastness. This pull toward the invisible wasn't taught to you, it was given to you, and you followed it, sometimes consciously, sometimes without realizing. You sought quiet spaces. You loved the moments between noise. There was something about stillness that felt full to you, not empty. At times, you experienced things you couldn't explain. Perhaps you felt like someone was watching over you when no one was there. Perhaps you had dreams that felt like memories, or you knew something was about to happen before it did. Not often, not clearly, but just enough to unsettle and awaken you. These moments didn't scare you, not entirely. They intrigued you. They made you wonder if there was more to life than what people said. You might not have had anyone to share these thoughts with, but you carried them anyway, like small treasures hidden in your pocket. Books and stories were more than entertainment, they felt like home. Especially the ones that spoke of other worlds, hidden realms, or secret purposes. You didn't just enjoy those tales, you recognized them. Something in you whispered, yes, this is how the world truly is. You began to suspect that the unseen was not just a fantasy, but the deeper truth beneath what everyone else called real. And though you learnt to function in that surface world, to laugh, to play, to obey, your heart never stopped listening for the deeper voice. You may have tried to push this feeling aside at times, to be normal, to blend in, to forget, but it always returned. The invisible had a way of calling you back through a sunset, a sentence, a shadow, or a sudden stillness that made you stop and remember. You were never alone in your longing. Something was always reaching out to you just beyond the veil. You weren't imagining it. You were sensing what others had forgotten how to feel. There were times in your childhood when the world felt heavier than it should have. You noticed sorrow where others saw only routine. A broken wing on a bird could haunt you for hours. A harsh word spoken to someone else could leave you quiet for the rest of the day. You didn't always know why it affected you so deeply, but you felt things others brushed off. It wasn't a matter of being overly sensitive or fragile. It was something deeper, a kind of emotional sight that allowed you to perceive wounds others had learned to ignore. You weren't just aware of your own feelings. You absorbed the atmosphere around you like a sponge, feeling the tension in a room before anyone spoke, sensing when someone's smile didn't match their eyes. It didn't always make sense. Sometimes you would cry, not because something had happened to you, but because something had happened near you. A friend's fear, a stranger's pain, even the sadness in a story could hit you with a force that seemed disproportionate, and when you were the one hurting, The pain often felt deeper than what the situation might have called for. Your tears were not just about scraped knees or lost toys. They came from a place you couldn't quite explain, as if they were tapping into a well far larger than yourself. This well of empathy, though confusing at times, was a sign of something rare, the ability to carry part of the world's burden before you even understood what that meant. And then there were the trials that came without explanation, the loneliness that seemed to find you even in a crowded room, the sense that something inside you was always being tested. Maybe you were misunderstood. Maybe you were the quiet one in a loud family, or the strange one among more predictable peers. Or maybe life handed you moments too difficult for a child to carry. Grief, instability, illness, or fear. These things came not because you deserved them, but because you were being shaped. Chosen ones are often introduced to pain early, not as punishment, but as preparation. You learned to sit with sadness rather than run from it. You grew accustomed to holding questions that didn't have easy answers, and somehow, through all of this, your heart remained soft. You didn't become bitter. You might have grown quiet, cautious, or even withdrawn for a time, but you still noticed when someone else was hurting. You still cared, even when no one cared for you in return. That was the strength you didn't know you had, to feel deeply and still stay open. There's something mysterious about this kind of early pain or heightened empathy. It's not random. It marks the soul. It trains you to listen, not just with your ears, but with your whole being. It shows you how to recognize truth in others, and most importantly, it gives you compassion, the kind that cannot be faked or taught, the kind that only comes from having walked through the valley yourself. It may have made you different, it may have made childhood more complicated, but it also made you capable of carrying light into places most people never dare to go. Where others avert their eyes, you look. Where others pass by, you stop. Not because it's easy, but because something in you refuses to ignore the cry of another. That refusal is not weakness, it is the signature of someone marked for something greater. When you were young, there were moments that felt like glimpses into another life, like windows briefly opening onto a sky you couldn't quite name. You may not have understood it then, but there were times when your imagination seemed to stretch far beyond your years. You saw yourself not just as you were, but as someone meant for something extraordinary. Perhaps you imagined yourself leading great journeys, discovering hidden lands, or standing before some vast and invisible challenge only you could meet. These were not passing daydreams, not mere play. They carried a weight, a kind of solemnity, as though your spirit knew truths your mind had not yet caught up with. At night, your dreams were sometimes strange, vivid and filled with images that lingered long after you awoke. You might not have remembered every detail, but the feeling remained, the feeling of being in a place more real than reality, of being part of something ancient and wide. These dreams weren't always peaceful. Some were filled with tension, decisions, or mystery, but they left you with the impression that you were part of a story that stretched far beyond the walls of your home. And during the day, these impressions would rise again in quiet moments, while staring out of a window, while walking alone, or while reading a book that stirred something deep inside you. You might have seen signs in the ordinary shadows that made you pause, a flicker of light that felt significant, a word spoken by someone that seemed meant for you. Of course, you didn't talk about it much. You knew instinctively that most people would dismiss it. They would call it imagination, coincidence, or fantasy, and so you carried it quietly, like a private truth. You returned to it when you were alone. It gave you a sense of meaning that nothing else quite matched. While others were content with what was, you kept reaching for what could be. The stories that captured you most were not the ones with the happiest endings, but the ones where the hero had to face impossible odds. You didn't just enjoy those stories, you saw yourself in them. Even when no one said it aloud, something in you felt chosen, though you had no proof and no roadmap. It was not a sense of superiority, it was more like a whisper, one that grew louder when you were quiet enough to hear it, a voice that said, "One day you'll be called. One day all of this will make sense." You didn't need anyone to assign you a role, you gave yourself one. You imagined battles that had never been fought, victories that only existed in your thoughts. And yet, they felt real. They felt like rehearsals for something that hadn't arrived yet. You trained yourself to be brave in small ways, to resist what felt false, to speak when silence seemed easier, and every time you acted out those stories in your mind, it wasn't for attention, it was because deep down, you believed there was something to prepare for. Adults often think children play to escape, but you weren't escaping. You were returning to something you already knew. You were drawn to the heroic, to the mystical, to the grand and impossible, not because you were bored, but because your spirit recognized a shape it was made to fit. Your visions were not accidents. They were early signs, clues, invitations. And though you grew older and life grew louder, part of you never stopped looking for the door that those dreams first opened. As a child, you felt a natural pull toward things that were fragile, broken, or misunderstood. It wasn't something you had to be taught. If you saw a stray animal, you felt compelled to help it. If another child was being left out or mocked, you noticed before anyone else. There was a sense of responsibility in you, a quiet instinct that leaned toward care rather than control. You didn't seek power for the sake of having it. You sought it only when it meant protecting something that couldn't protect itself. That early desire to shield, to mend, to guard was not simply kindness, it was a sign. You didn't always have the tools or the words to fix what was wrong, but you tried anyway. Maybe you bandaged a wounded bird with clumsy fingers, whispered encouragement to a crying friend, or tried to comfort someone in silence just by being near. And when you couldn't fix it, it hurt. Not just in passing, but deeply. You felt helplessness, not as frustration, but as a kind of sacred sorrow, because something in you knew that your heart had been shaped to stand between harm and the vulnerable. Others might have looked away, but you leaned in. Others might have laughed, but you stayed serious, not out of moodiness, but out of reverence for things that mattered more than jokes. Even in play, your roles often involved healing or defending. You were the one who rescued, who restored, who stood watch at the edge of danger. Your toys were not just props in a story. They were companions you wanted to see thrive. You became attached, not because you didn't understand they were inanimate, but because something in you practiced loyalty and gentleness, even in pretend. And sometimes it extended to objects, to things left forgotten or broken. You picked up what others discarded. You felt sorrow over torn pages, cracked vases, toys thrown away. Something about brokenness called out to you, not as an end, but as a beginning. You didn't see ruins. You saw potential waiting to be loved. There was also a justice in your care. You couldn't stand to see cruelty, even in small forms. If someone cheated a game or lied about another person, it burned inside you. You may not have spoken up every time, but you carried it. You remembered. It wasn't that you were obsessed with rules. It was that you believed in fairness, in goodness, in a world where the strong didn't use their strength to harm. If something seemed unfair, your spirit bristled, not with rebellion, but with quiet, righteous discomfort. And when you did speak, it wasn't to accuse, it was to defend. You didn't need recognition. You weren't interested in being the center of attention. But if something needed to be made right, you couldn't rest. You would stay up late thinking about what you could have done, or how you might do better next time. It wasn't about guilt, it was about purpose. You weren't trying to prove anything to the world. You were trying to live in alignment with something you couldn't yet name. The urge to protect and repair was not a fleeting phase of childhood empathy. It was a thread woven into your being, showing itself early and often. That thread connected you to something greater than yourself. You didn't ask to be a guardian, a mender, a quiet shield, but you were one. And the world, though it may not have thanked you, was already better because you were in it, noticing what others ignored, caring when others didn't, and stepping in with a kind of courage most people didn't even see. There were times in your childhood when silence didn't feel empty, it felt full. You could sit alone for long stretches without needing noise or company, not because you were lonely, but because solitude gave you something no crowd ever could. In those quiet hours, something stirred. Ideas would rise like mist in your mind, uninvited but welcome. You weren't afraid of being alone with your thoughts. In fact, you often preferred it. While other children might have feared stillness, you sensed it as a doorway. There was something sacred about those moments when the world slowed down and the distractions fell away. You weren't just sitting idly, you were listening, watching, receiving. It's not that you didn't enjoy laughter or play, you did. But beneath even your brightest moments, there was a deep, quiet center inside you, a place you rarely shared. It was in this place that you started to notice patterns others missed. You saw how people behaved when they thought no one was watching. You caught glimpses of sadness behind smiles. You sensed when something important was being left unsaid. This wasn't a skill you learned. It was something you carried. Your inner world was not a retreat from life. It was a way of seeing through it. You could sit in a room and pick up on things that hadn't been spoken aloud. And though you didn't always understand what you were sensing, you felt its truth. There was a kind of wisdom that began to grow in you long before you had the words to express it. You didn't always know how to explain what you felt, but you knew when something felt off. Adults might have dismissed your quiet insights, mistaking your silence for distraction or disinterest. But inside, your thoughts were alive, alert, and vast. You thought not only about what things were, but what they meant. You questioned what others accepted. You wondered why people did things they didn't believe in. You wondered what would happen if someone chose to live from truth instead of fear. These weren't just mental exercises. They were seeds of something much deeper, forming inside you. Your sense of timing was different too. You weren't always in a hurry. You didn't rush from one thing to the next just to fill space. You knew, without being told, that some things required stillness to be heard, and some answers only arrived when you stopped looking for them. In a noisy world that rewards speed and volume, this ability to be still was not always understood, but it shaped you. You could sit by a window and feel more alive than you did in the middle of a crowd. You found meaning in watching the way shadows moved across walls, in the rhythm of rain against glass, in the way a single sentence from a book could echo inside you for days. And perhaps in those quiet hours you heard things, not with your ears, but with something deeper, a nudge, a whisper, a knowing that didn't come from logic. When you followed those nudges, you often found yourself in the right place at the right time. When you ignored them, something in you felt restless. This was not imagination, it was intuition. And it didn't come from outside you, it came through you. You may not have always known what to do with it, but it shaped your decisions, your friendships, your fears, and your courage. You were never just daydreaming, you were listening to the world behind the world. And from a young age, that world spoke to you. Not loudly, not with fanfare, but with a quiet, steady voice that seemed to come from somewhere older than memory and deeper than thought. And so, if any of these signs stirred something in you, if the words felt like memories rather than mere ideas, then perhaps you were never ordinary, even in your smallest moments. The signs were there, not carved in stone, but whispered in feeling, in vision, in silence, and in sorrow. You were not chosen by chance or by mistake. You were shaped quietly, in the shadows of your youth, by unseen hands and silent truths. You were not made to blend in, but to bear light. Light that can only be carried by those who have walked through both wonder and weight. The world may never give you a title or a crown, but it will need what only you can offer. And deep down, some part of you already knows you were chosen, not for ease, but for purpose.